let me welcome everybody to another one of Mission Alive's Innovative Church Conversations. We are trying to talk with leaders from around the country and pick their brains about what it takes for the church to innovate in this season of North American history. And in the last couple of years, we've come upon a book, and today we get to talk with its author, Christopher James. Christopher is a professor at Dubuque Theological Seminary in Iowa. And so, Christopher, on behalf of Mission Alive and whoever else might hit this, thank you for joining us. Thanks for giving us a few minutes of your time.
My pleasure. Always glad to talk with folks that are trying to translate research into practice.
Well, indeed we are. We're trying to do very, very good practice, and so you have contributed to that tremendously, and we appreciate it. We like to get started with these by getting to know the people that are speaking to us a little bit on the personal level. So I'd like to ask you to take about 5 minutes and just give us your your bio, your spiritual journey, where you come from, how you were raised, what have been some of your spiritual highs and lows, where are you now, etc. Just take about 5 minutes and let us peer inside a little bit.
Sure. Happy to share. Well, let me just say thank you for the invitation, and thanks to those of you who are on the call. Happy to engage with your questions along the way. I grew up in the suburbs of Seattle, raised by mom and a dad who loved the Lord, took us to church. We sort of floated around between various evangelical and charismatic churches. My parents sent me to private Christian schooling there, which certainly was a blessing in my case. I grew up with a sense, as I write in the book, that being a Christian wasn't normal, and yet God was with us. A certain sense of what I began to explore later on about what it looks like to be a Christian in a post-Christian kind of nation or culture or society. I went off to college, Wheaton College, really because not that I really needed or was insistent on being in a Christian environment, but I wanted to stretch myself academically. I had worked pretty hard in high school and gotten all A's, and I wanted to get some reward for that. So I got into a place that was hard to get into. So at Wheaton, I'll say one of the real discoveries and joys of my time there, well, two probably are worth mentioning here. One, as God would have it, my roommates ended up being missionary kids from East Africa. As I said, I had grown up really in the suburbs, so I knew white American evangelicalism. That was sort of my scope of Christianity, and obviously these two friends who grew up in the midst of a very different flavor and brand of Christianity expanded my sense of the church and really my sense of the world. In a way that also began to grow in me sort of a global awareness and a social consciousnness. As my mom would tell you, every time she bought me a gift, I said, return it and give the money to the poor. I was sort of on this real kick because I was understanding in a new way the social implications of the gospel. Also, during my time at Wheaton, I participated in a group called Youth Hostel Ministry, which wasn't working with hostile youth, although that could have its own value. It was traveling around the hostel circuit in Western Europe and seizing the opportunities to strike up a conversation about faith with fellow travelers. And that experience for me was both incredibly powerful, real strong moments of feeling God's leading and opportunity, and also frustration with some of the social dynamics on the team and the organizational aspects of that organization. So when I came back, I wrote a letter, email to the director of all the ministries, and I said, what was the philosophy of ministry here? Because there was all this confusion. And wisely, Tim Sisk at the time said, why don't you help us figure that out better for next year? So I got wrapped into leadership in that ministry, which really did, it was my first taste and exposure to evangelism as a regular practice in the life of my faith. Um, I'm probably near the end of my time here. So from Wheaton, I ended up serving a church back in Seattle, a Presbyterian USA church. First time I'd ever stepped foot in one is I was working for one as an intern, a larger church, and was discerning at that time a call into ministry. So through the 2 years there, really some great, a pastor to the interns was a formative mentor for me during that time, and discerned a call to ministry, went down to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. During that time, married my wife, Lindsay, who was also a student and at the seminary, also on the ordination track in the PCUSA. So after graduation, we moved to the Silicon Valley, served what's now called Menlo Church, John Ortberg's former church there in the Bay Area. We followed her role, but eventually it got opened an opportunity for me. And, the longer story short, while I was there, I was both learning all that the megachurch has to offer and becoming all the more acquainted with some of its flaws and shortcomings. So after that time, really during that time, started having a curiosity and a hunger for more organic and creative and I'll say human-sized communities of church. And so that propelled me into my PhD program, so we moved across the country to Boston, where I studied at Boston University School of Theology, a very different denominational environment, which is, you'd call it very liberal mainline Protestant at BU. And of course, Fuller and Wheaton would be squarely evangelical. So that mix of experiences, but really had great advisors at BU, and started digging in my research, which eventually then became the book that we're going to be talking about today, looking at something that really is a statement of faith, which is God's at work in even the places that people might write off as God-forsaken. And my research then in Seattle was basically doing some empirical and theological reflection on signs of God's work through these new communities that had taken shape in a place that I knew, having grown up there, had an active and fervent witness to Christianity. So I think that's the story. There's of course a lot of other twists and turns. Really, I'll say at this point, I'm more and more convinced that we are on a trajectory as a nation and as the church that's going to take us into some very unfamiliar territory. And as Alan Roxburgh would put it, the maps that have served the church for the last generation are not going to serve the next generation very well. And so I'm all the more eager to keep learning from those places and people that are sort of on the edge of increasing trends, like disaffiliation and polarization is another. I mean, there's all kinds of trends that we can suggest sort of look like the future, and pray and discern what does it look like to be God's faithful people in the midst of such a place. So I think it's going to be a wild ride these next several decades that I'll continue to serve. And hopefully the research that I did, that we're talking about in this book, gives some clues about what kind of work God is up to in places like that.
Very, very good. Thank you for that. I find it's very helpful to kind of get a sense of your own journey, to hear you in the context of your journey. So I want to say to everybody that's on here with us listening to Chris, please feel free to use the chat function and post any questions that come to mind. If you've been on our conversations before, I'll interview Chris for a little while, but then I'll turn to the questions that are over there. So don't leave me hanging. Post some questions that come up in your mind as we're talking. So Christopher, your last couple of comments there really serve as a great segue into my next question. And that really is, as you look out across Christianity in North America, how would you characterize it in 2021?
I was just reading today. I'm a co-editor for a journal called Ecclesial Futures, I was reviewing an article that had been submitted that was looking at what's happening in the church in Scotland. And the argument of this article is very much similar to the argument of my book and how I'll answer that question, which is simply the landscape of Christianity is changing. Its context is changing and its form is changing. We have left the long period of, you could call it Christendom. It wasn't formally Christendom, but it basically a period in which Christian identity, affiliation, and practice gained you social standing, at least in places, a lot of places, a lot of urban places, coastal places. That's history. So that is a massive change. It also means, there's very little motivation for nominal Christians to maintain that kind of identity. You also find in places like Seattle and other places that the percent of the population that is deeply invested in their faith, in many places in the US, that's something like a quarter of the population, is pretty stable. So what that sets up is a sort of fervent minority. And sometimes that can become, divisive and in a bad way, but it also sort of situates the church as potentially as a beautiful minority witness in the midst of a broader culture. So that's sort of the big picture. I think the big trends are not something we're going to change in the immediate future about, generations disaffiliating. Churches are going to keep closing. But as I write in my book, that same season is also a season of exploration and reimagining and creativity. So I think a lot of how you read the time depends on what you're looking at. If you just want to follow the numbers of affiliation, you can tell the story of this is a time of basically the decline of the church. But I think it's actually the time in which God is offering the church a new future and inviting us on a new adventure.
Oh man, I don't know about the rest of you, but that last statement might be worth the price of admission to this conversation today. Very, very good. If you could, if you were king of the universe or whatever, and you could snap your fingers and bring about one immediate innovation in the North American church, what would you want to see quickly develop?
Wow, you use that language of innovation. I know it's important to these calls. I'll tell you about something I'm doing that's sort of innovative and really it emerged from the research in the book. But I would say this: I would love to see churches reorient to their geography and to their fellow believers inside of that geography. So I'm involved right now in a project we're calling Awaken Dane for Dane County. It's just the area surrounding Madison, Wisconsin. We recently got a Lilly grant to do this work, which is bringing together churches across the whole ecumenical spectrum, not only to pray together, study together, serve together, but primarily to discern together. Meaning engage in a 2-year process in which the question at the heart of it is what's God up to in our midst and how are we called to play along, participate with what God is up to. I mean, it would be a huge shift for so many churches to change the question. Here's maybe the best way to put this: change the question from how do we stay alive, or how do we grow, or even how do we reach more people, to what is God up to and how do we join? I mean, that is a deep shift, and frankly, all our efforts on this side are being thwarted with that first set of questions. I think God is inviting us into that second set of questions because we need something more fundamental than a new strategy or an innovative technique to reach people. We need to make first things first again, which the first thing for the church is to hear, notice, pay attention to what God is doing, and reorient everything, our worship, our daily life, our practice of community, our consumption patterns, whatever, around entering that life, which is it's life with God.
Yeah. I thought you were about to stumble on that, but you knocked it out of the park. So take your four models that you identified through your research, and kind of give us an armchair definition of each. So for those on the call or who might watch this video later who have not read the book yet, give them just a short armchair description of each of the models.
Okay, so the four models that I found, I identified all the new churches in Seattle, and then from survey data from these churches, I sort of identified what were the key features, their key practices, beliefs, activities, and through the survey data, I sorted these into the four categories I'm going to describe. And the first is probably maybe most familiar to this group. I call the Great Commission team. I filter the survey data through a theological, sort of ecclesiological set of categories. And these are the evangelical churches who understand themselves as fulfilling the Great Commission. They organize themselves strategically. Often they are churches that see the city as their scope rather than the neighborhood. This is sort of very, very familiar sort of mission approach, but brought home to the American urban context. So the Great Commission team, many of those churches were planting with the missional communities kind of model. We can talk more about that if you'd like. The second, also pretty familiar, I call the Household of the Spirit model. A decent portion of these were ethnically specific congregations, but what sort of typifies the model is a Pentecostal or charismatic spiritual tradition. Unlike the Great Commission team, where there's a very, very high premium on talking to your friends, your neighbors about faith, the sort of most evangelistic priority in the Household of the Spirit is bring your folks to church so they can encounter God in the midst of what would really be a significant spiritual encounter. So emotional, energetic kinds of worship gatherings. Of course, familiar things you'd see in Pentecostal churches, emphasis on healing, emphasis on other gifts of the Spirit. So that's the second one. The third one is sort of on the other end of the theological spectrum. I call the new community. These are churches that are affiliated with mainline denominations, but they are sort of fresh iterations. These would have, a decade or more ago been called emerging churches. They're often doing, creative things, playing with the arts, sort of putting an emphasis on their participatory practices, meaning, sort of a flat hierarchy of how decisions are made, blurring the lines between sacred and secular in a way to draw near to the culture. So those three, in a certain way, they are sort of fresh expressions of familiar categories, right? The fourth category is a little harder to unpack because it's not distinguished by its denominations or its theological tradition or spirituality. The thing that distinguishes the fourth category, which I call neighborhood incarnation churches, is the way they identify closely with a sort of neighborhood rather than the city as a whole. A high priority on proximity as definitive of their identity and their mission. And there were churches in that neighborhood incarnation model that were also in each of the other three models. So it's a Venn diagram, right? There's an overlap between the neighborhood incarnation and each of the others. But what was, again, specific about the neighborhood incarnation model was sort of a dislocating of worship as such a high priority and making mission and community sort of equally important or even more important in the life rhythms of the church. A sense that, so here, let me draw this contrast that I think is sometimes helpful. The Great Commission team feels sort of a call to a global mission that's primarily about evangelism. So, saving souls in a holistic sense, but in sort of that evangelistic sense. That's the Great Commission team. They come to the city because the city is a strategic point for influencing the nation, influencing the nations. Whereas the neighborhood incarnation have what I would say is a more holistic sense of what their mission is. They care about evangelism, but also about social projects, about community, about lonely people, about everything that happens inside their neighborhood. School districts, so they're very often very involved on local boards. Very often they would, their primary building wasn't a worship space, but some sort of community space, a third place, something you may be familiar with. So they would care about everything inside their little area, whereas Great Commission teams churches would care about evangelism everywhere. But the priority wouldn't necessarily be on the what's happening in the neighborhood. So one pastor in the neighborhood incarnation said, we care about whatever our mission priorities are, whatever the mission priorities are for our neighborhood. So there you go. There's the 4 types.
Yep. Very good. Thank you. Well, Kevin from Regina has posted a question that I think fits right here really well. Kevin, you want to unmute and come and ask your question?
I'm just curious, Chris. I really like this typology, and I thank you for it. Did you go into your research with kind of a leaning or preference towards neighborhood incarnational churches, or did that arise out of your research, or a combination?
Yeah, no, so that's a very fair question. I certainly went into the research with some curiosity about whether and how significant neighborhood identity was. I didn't start out with the 4 categories. And I mean, I could have predicted probably the first 3 types, but I struggled for a while to figure out when I realized there was really only 3 types that mapped onto different spiritual or theological traditions. Those are the 3 dominant types. It took me a while to figure out how to sort the remainder of the data in a way. And as I said, I had to basically figure out what held together. I mean, it's statistical kinds of analysis. So, I mean, it's defensible sort of statistically, but I'll say I had a hunch. I knew coming in and early on that there was a movement among churches in Seattle to be hyper-local. If you've heard of the Parish Collective or Inhabit, which is a conference that takes place there in Seattle, that's been a value for, I don't know, it's maybe a decade or so. And I knew of a few churches at the beginning that were living into that, but I had to see if it was really robust enough to represent something unique. And so, yeah, it was a question, which is why I built into the survey questions about that gave them the opportunity to identify the significance of their neighborhood or their city. But it came out of the data before I slapped it on there and said, this is going to be a conclusion.
What was the question? In chapter 6, and I hope this doesn't come off as a pop quiz.
No, it's all right. I don't have it in front of me though, so
it's okay. I'll read the highlights. So in chapter 6, you highlight what you call renewing practices for each of the 4 models of church. Mm-hmm. And so you've got, let me see, renewing practice for neighborhood incarnation, structure local discernment, foster local ecumenism. Can you describe that in greater detail?
Yeah, well, just so for those who may not have read the book, what I do in the preceding chapter is I basically address the strengths and weaknesses theologically of each of the 4 models. And then in the chapter you're describing, Todd, I try to look at some best practices from within each model that can avoid some of the pitfalls that can go wrong in that model and sort of build on the strengths within that model. So as I said before, the neighborhood incarnation model sort of prides itself on having a neighborhood identity. And the first practice, renewing practice that Todd mentioned there, structuring local discernment, is to say, make good on your claim that you care about the neighborhood by structuring, building some processes whereby the people of your church are asking, as I was saying at the beginning, this question of what's God up to, how are we called to join? Processes are something that especially neighborhood incarnation churches, the new community churches, were sometimes better at. They had like, a 1-year process for figuring something out as a collective group. But that particular prescription is to say, make good on your aspirations to participate with what God is up to by building a process for your people to be engaged in that discernment. There's any number of ways that could look. In a certain way, that's what I'm doing in Dane County. We're using a resource from the Missional Network, Alan Roxburgh's organization. They've got a resource called Stepping Out, which is basically a process through which a small group is engaging with the neighborhood, is reflecting on scripture and reflecting on, what that reveals about what God's up to and how God's calling the church. So, but there's any number of ways a church might structure that. I'll give one other bit of language for that was helpful for me. One of my seminary professors, Mark Lau Branson, stresses the fact that one of the roles of the pastor is to form the church into an interpretive community, which is very different than to see the role of the pastor as to be the visionary that leads the church into where God's calling it. And I'm with my professor, Mark Lau Branson, who sees it as the pastor's work to help the whole people become a discerning body, become an interpretive community. And that means helping them learn how to exegete scripture, but also exegete context with that question about where's God calling us, what's God up to. So that's structure local discernment. What was the second one there, Todd, that I mentioned?
Foster local ecumenism.
Yeah, so foster local ecumenism. I recently tweeted, you try to be pithy on Twitter, if you're on Twitter. But I said, I think the future of ecumenism is local. If anyone here knows the history of ecumenism, it shot up in part from some local successes like Leslie Newbegin's success in South India, and then became a global effort, and then sort of exists now mostly in national and statewide bodies that tend to do most of their work with sort of adjudicatory. So like they don't really work with congregations. They work with the bodies that supervise congregations. And my sense is that the promise and possibility of ecumenism, because Jesus prayed, make them one as you and I are one. Okay, so I believe Jesus intends to see that fulfilled, and I want to be part of participating in the answer to Jesus's prayer. So local ecumenism on a very simple level looks like figuring out who the other pastors in town are, and building a relationship on the basis of, even though we have maybe some important differences, I still think God wants me to see you as a brother or a sister. And on that basis, I think we ought to learn to love each other and then go from there. Really, learning to speak well of one another, learning when there's possibilities to collaborate. One thing I'm exploring, this is still at the idea level right now, but I'm exploring here in Dubuque whether it would be possible to identify, say, the 6 churches where I'm well acquainted with the pastor, and see if they wouldn't be willing to share with me their their member manual, so I can figure out all those church folks from those different churches that live in my actual neighborhood, right, which is a pretty 6 blocks, maybe something like that. Not so that I can steal them away from my Sunday event, but so that I can foster things on Thursdays or Saturdays that would bring the believers in this neighborhood together as good neighbors. And then locally we can do that kind of discernment. So that's what I have in mind with local ecumenism, is really figure out who are the actual Christian neighbors and other churches with whom God has called you to be engaged in God's and witness to the gospel.
That's a really powerful challenge. Ooh, I love your vision there, though, and taking it from the national, international level down to the local level. I don't guess I'd ever thought about that ecumenical movement being more successful on the higher levels than on the. It's obvious, but I guess that thought had never occurred to me. So you also go ahead.
I just emphasize this because it's one of the things that stood out in my research in Seattle, and it's been duplicated here in my research in Madison and Dane County, is the polarization that's in our culture is exactly mapped in our churches. And it's evangelical and mainline Protestant is sort of the poles, and both of those Christian identities are largely identities in distinction, meaning you want to know who we are? We're not them. And that's not what Jesus prayed for. So yeah, it's really, you read Paul, his vision for how the church stands out is that it had broken down the fundamental poles and divisions in the Roman world, that there was a unity, a mingling, a fellowship between those whom the world saw as diametrically opposed or opposites or something like that. So I think that is one of the real problems of denominationalism. It's one of the dilemmas we face when churchgoers are basically church consumers rather than committed to a local body. But yeah, it is a deep challenge. I'm working in Madison right now. How big of a spectrum you gotta work with people who are willing to acknowledge the brother or sisterhood of others. So that does take some people off on either end.
We've got a question here from Terrell McTire. Terrell works in church planting and discipleship for the Disciples of Christ. Terrell, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Ideally, how would a church planting network or denomination use this data to shift the way that we start or support churches, new churches?
It's a great question. Todd, I'm trying to remember. I do have some particular advice in the following chapters. Maybe it's the last chapter. One of the things that I would suggest would be, it's not totally new, but strategies that give a long on-ramp for starting and that don't start, basically have the planter and planting team there for a year before you're really trying to start anything. Locate them, get them a job where it's high touch with the community. So, right, is that Starbucks or whatever. But this is all assuming that the pastor is not going to start a church. The team is not going to start a church until they have a sense of the landscape of what kind of church God wants to see come to birth there. And so, that's one approach that also gives the pastor time to do other things that you probably are familiar with, right? Talk to the other pastors in town, but not just the people who are your natural friends, but get a real sense of what I call the ecclesial ecology. So you can have a sense of where there might be room in the ecclesial ecology. Another piece of it is don't bring people in. Use people who are already there. Terrell, I'd love to say more to that, but I think those are the ones that come off the top of my head.
Sure, thank you. It is Terrell, by the way.
Oh, excuse me, Terrell.
No problem. It's Todd's fault.
It is my fault.
Your answers were more so advice for the church planter.
Yeah.
And I'm asking you to speak to us as judicatory or network leaders in the way that we support the planters. And if nothing comes to mind, that's perfectly okay. But I either find that we're not using data to change our strategy or change the way in which we do things, or the data is there and wait, I'm thinking I'm saying that the same way. Either there's not a data, we're making decisions without first finding the data to support the decision, even if we're right, or we're not, something's not happening with the relationship between data and strategizing. And so that's what as you have come up with this data, I'm trying to understand how that will inform the way we strategize, the way we support new churches, and how we do things differently.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's really important. And I think I might need to think on it some more to give you an answer. I mean, I think on the macro level, I just think networks, I mean, this will not be new to you, I'm sure, but I think we need to see this time period in the history of the American church as R&D. I mean, the sort of networks and adjudicatories I'm connected with are rightfully kind of interested in, we want to support things that are going to succeed. I think there needs to be some margin inside of those efforts to say we need to support things that are going to teach us important things, even if they don't succeed. So, you know, you might say it might be the case that the surefire way to plant a successful church is, you know, get 50 people from another church, use the prepackaged model, get this kind of space. But we also need people who are really exploring new models, at least if I'm right, which is that this upending of the apple cart is really just getting started. We need a lot of creativity. We need a lot of failure in order to imagine new ways of being church. I mean, let me just put this out there. It's not being done a lot, but I think a lot of the churches going forward are going to need to have models where there are a much more plural leadership. So like, let's say 5 pastors, they've all got other jobs, and they collectively are giving leadership to the church and not depending on the offering plate. I mean, this is a big one. Is the offering plate really a financial strategy for the future? In a lot of churches, it's not. A lot of churches, it's not. So monetizing property is another big category for, do we have existing churches that we can use that property to somehow generate a revenue stream, and then maybe we don't even need that building in order to support the life of a new church. That's what comes off the top of my head, but I'm happy to hear thoughts from others or try to say more.
No, I appreciate what you're saying. I think one of the things I'm trying to change is to create an ethos of experimentation.
Absolutely.
In any experiment, the experiments are driven by the data, by the research, by the failures, by this hypothesis that you put out there and you just continually try to support. And I think that's a good way in which to relate the data by doing what you're saying, allowing there to be some new expressions.
Yeah.
In the midst of that, recognizing that church planters are very disruptive, they're very rogue, they forge forward, and there's really no slowing them down once they feel like God has called them to do something right now.
Yeah.
And so it can be very challenging to say, hey, take a year to do this, go and do this, and all of that is a really challenging nuance.
You really need someone in the network whose job it is to collect the wisdom that's being generated out of all these experiments, because as you say, many of the pioneers, they're hardly going to stop to write things down, you know, especially depending on their financial situation and the urgency with which they feel the call. This is one reason why I think, if you all are familiar with Michael Moyna, a significant author who's been documenting the learnings from the Fresh Expressions movement over in the UK. I don't know exactly what his position is, but he's culling the wisdom of their experiences in order to give them back to the church. And so, yeah, again, having people who have gifts to interview, learn from, collect both stories and data really is how we would appropriately make use of an experimental phase, right? It's not just do a bunch of experiments. You got to actually record what you're learning from them.
So let me jump back in here and encourage others, if you have questions that are floating up to the surface, to go ahead and start putting them in the chat window over there. I'm going to keep us moving with this question. I'm going to shift our attention to chapter 7, where you offer some practical wisdom that you sort of determine from your research. Let me read through them and then I'll pose my question. So 1 is embrace local identity and local mission. Number 2, cultivate embodied, experiential, and everyday spiritualities. Recognizing community life as both witness and formation. Prioritizing hospitality as a cornerstone practice. And 5th, discovering vitality in a diverse ecclesial ecology. So, boy, I found that chapter so rich, and I continue to go back to it and find more. My question is, in your mind, as you look out across kind of this North American Christian landscape, if you could zero in on 1 or 2 of those and say, right now is the time for this. We got to prioritize this one or these 2, as important as all 5 are. Which ones would you first point us to?
Okay, I think I can do that. The 2 that I would address, and I'll get specific on one of them. So in the section on community life as both witness, and I forget how it says it, but one of the things that I'm talking about there is the rhythms of the life of the church and how those both form the disciples and bear witness to the wider community about what you all think it means to be a disciple. And at the heart of that, and this is for so many churches, and especially, a lot of the churches I'm working with through my teaching and in Madison are mainline churches. So a lot of them are sort of, they're older. A lot of the congregations are. So I think this goes across the spectrum, but this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the interpretive community. Nancy Ammerman uses the language of sacred consciousness. Nancy Ammerman, a sociologist, she's done research on the spiritual but not religious. It's basically how do people maintain a sense that the world is a place in which God's alive and at work. And a big finding from her research is just very simple. Those people who have that sacred consciousness, they look at their life in that way, they have conversation partners in which they're talking about life in the context of faith in God. And so it really is, I think, imperative for our churches to have a regular rhythm where most of the people of the church are participating in it, in which they are becoming fluent in talking about God as an actor in their lives. It's a vocabulary of faith, which is so different than the church situation where you might sit, you might hear a sermon, you might even read the Bible, right? But the practice of conversation, of both hearing regular people talk about God in their life and asking yourself, how might have I noticed God this week? Just on that simple level, really is a simple practice. It could be in a small group. It could be in the coffee hour if you could really turn the coffee hour that direction. It could be in a missional community, could be in accountability partners. I mean, it could be in any particular sort of programming environment, but to make conversation about what's God up to a basic Christian discipleship practice. It relates to that category. The other one I would say is really urgent is that hospitality one. And hospitality isn't just, let's get really good at welcoming people who show up to our church. That's actually not at all what I'm talking about. It's both, let's learn how to make space in our lives for others, and let's learn how to look for the spaces that people open up to us and step into them. So hospitality is not just about being the host, right? Go for that, right? If your neighbors will come over to your house, that's great. I'm not against that. But one measure of faithful mission is how many people have invited you over? and you know, that'll tell you something. And you know, with my students and in my current teaching, one of the things that we practice is pray regularly, that you would notice the invitations that others extend you, and then see those as dually an invitation from the person and from God, and so you better say yes. You know, if they mention, oh yeah, I'm presenting my art show such and such, that means, hey, would you be interested in come seeing, you know, my art show? This sense of really the story of Peter and Cornelius, in which that encounter with the God-fearing neighbor, the God-fearing Gentile, is the way that the future of the church opens up for Peter and for the rest of the church. So practicing.
Drill into that a minute.
Sure. Well, let me, Daryl Guter, who I suppose will be well known, he wrote a book, The Continuing Conversion of the Church, in which he makes much of this very passage, in which, if you remember, Peter has this vision of all this food, including unclean animals being lowered down. The voice says, eat. He says, certainly not. I would not defile myself. God insists. And then he wakes up from this vision and he's trying to make sense of it. And at the door, and it's a bunch of Gentiles saying, Cornelius is inviting you over. And that's a no-no, of course, but he's following, he's discerning sort of the double intention. This is not just an invitation from Cornelius, this is an invitation from the Spirit. He steps into that environment. They say, we're just waiting to hear what you have to say. And, you know, of course, we have a second Pentecost. Well, this is really not just the conversion of Cornelius, it's also the conversion of Peter. It is, to my mind, the paradigm for how God leads the church into new territory. And it's the ingredients there are prayer and vision. It is encounter with the neighbor that takes you into unfamiliar places you don't control. So he steps into the home of a Gentile. That's not the same as inviting people to an outreach at your church. Okay, see the difference here. It's the encounter. Then they go. This is the story, of course, goes to Acts 15, where Peter brings his story about what God has done. Paul and Barnabas bring their story about what God's doing among the Gentiles. James, if I've got it right, is it James or Peter who says, well, oh yeah, that makes sense of what the prophet said. And then they come to a conclusion. It seems good to the Holy Spirit in us. Well, I think we're in that kind of moment where we have to be open to what seems good to the Holy Spirit in us. Well, we need the stories, not just of strategies that work, not just effective strategies. That's not how we do the discernment. That matters. But the way we do the work is we need the stories in which God is an actor. How are we seeing God at work? We got to bring those stories into our discernment and reflection on Scripture and in prayer in order to find where God wants to be leading the church in the future. So hospitality really, for me, is a piece of that gets left out of many churches' discernment. You know, they'll get together, they'll do a Bible study, they'll pray, they'll look at strategy reports, but an assignment like everybody on the board needs to have dinner with 3 different people on their block and come back and share what they think God taught them out of those encounters is not usually part of the discernment equation. So I think that really is a important practice. One last thing I have to say about hospitality is it dislocates church folks from the comfortable positions of hosting. You know, you have someone over for dinner, they may try to play by your rules, but also just their presence and their habits could be a little jarring. You don't know. And especially if you go into their space where they are the host, or a neutral space where you're not in control, you learn to not be in control. And basically that's where God leads us, is when we recognize that we don't need to be in control of the situation, and we're willing to follow where the Spirit leads. I went a little bit long on that, but that's what I'd say. Bring conversation back into the heart of the life of the church and practice hospitality with the neighbor.
Chris, that is really fantastic. Thank you very much. Kevin has asked if you know the name of the guy that is, what is the name of the guy, if you know how to spell the name of the guy with Fresh Expressions that's doing
Okay. I'll get all the letters. I think I have them in the right order. Well, it's Michael, and then Moynagh, Moynagh. And he's written the one that's maybe several years old now is A Church for Every Context or something like that. He's got more recent titles too. I assign a very simple one, which actually would be great for a church planting team, called Doing Life, Being Church. A real simple, accessible book I use in one of my classes about sort of micro gospel communities in everyday life. And he's got other ones as well, but he's collecting stories. So all of his books have like hundreds of anecdotes and stories from churches, not just in Fresh Expressions, but especially from, Western Europe.
Yeah. I can't believe we are down to 4 minutes. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time and just the work you've put into it and your great ability to communicate it. As a seminary professor, you are dealing with young people by and large. And those of us in the church planting world, while we certainly have had people in their 50s and 60s plant with us, by and large, it's 20s and 30s that want to plant. So I'd like to ask you if you could say one thing, or maybe two things, to young leaders in this generation. What would you say? A piece of advice or wisdom you'd like to share?
Yeah, wow, this is my cousin. I won't say his name, but my cousin is currently sort of discerning, right, whether he's got a call to plant a church, and he's got this whole model mapped up. He's like ready to run, and then I don't know, something seemed to have caught him up, and he paused. He's like, I think I maybe need to take a few months before I just try to run ahead with this, and that's a big part of it to me. I think the energy of youth and the confidence that comes with youth is a huge gift. Here's how I put it: don't go it alone. And by that, I don't just mean I'm not just talking against the parachute model, which I don't think is a good model to start with, but I'm saying bring into your discernment as many people as you can, which means really taking it, practicing patience in the midst of passionate, sort of dangerous risk taking in the midst of doing it. So I would just, encourage them to step out, but don't step out alone. So that's what I would offer.
Oh, that's really good. Very good. Thanks so much for your time today. It's been a real blessing, and quite honestly, I could easily sit here and ask you another hour's worth of questions. And let me just recommend to everybody, of course, anybody in our network knows that I think this is one of the more important books for church planting in this age right now. So I highly recommend Chris's book. But as you can tell, Chris is doing strong academic work, so you're gonna have to pace yourself. But he's also offered us a PDF that is available in the link that we sent out when we created the invitation for this. If you can't find that, reach out to us in Mission Live. We will point you to it. But hey, Chris, thank you very much. Thanks for the work you do in the church, for the preparation of young leaders. We need guys like you to keep the rest of us sharp. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd, and thank you to all the rest of you. Blessings on the work that you're doing. May your discernment be fruitful.